I think you probably need to brush up on your understanding of international law with respect.
Well, I would be helped if you just give me a straight answer to a straight question.
Gaza has been subject to an ongoing occupation since 1967. The fact that Israel withdrew its illegal settlements and took most of its troops out of Gaza in 2005 does not alter the fact that it still remained legally occupied under international law.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Inshallah, in this video, I want to go through a video in which a pro-Zionist journalist, Andrew Neil, interviews a Palestinian activist known as Ben Jamal, who comes actually from a Palestinian Christian background and currently lives in England. And I think it really exemplifies the real issue regards to how the West, particularly mainstream media, seeks to try to frame the Palestinian resistance or even frame the so-called Israel-Palestine conflict as a defensive war for Israel and an aggressive war for the Palestinians. And, you know, anyway, look, have a watch of it. And inshallah, I'm going to comment upon certain points that I raised throughout the video. So, inshallah, let's take a look at it, inshallah.
Do you regard the Hamas attacks on civilians in Israel that took place 2 years ago as legitimate resistance against Israel?
Notice the question, the typical question. This is like only a few weeks ago, this interview that took place, and yet still after 2 years of what's now understood to be a genocide taking place against the Palestinians of Gaza, the same question still being asked, which is basically, do you condemn Hamas, or are you a sympathizer for Hamas, etc.? So this is the same question that's constantly being asked. And we know, and I won't go too much detail, but as you'll watch, you'll see the type of framing this pro-Zionist Andrew Neil, he used to be a BBC journalist, now he works for Times Radio, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch. You'll see the framing as he tries to attempt to frame and pigeonhole Ben Jamal into a particular bracket to push a particular narrative. So anyway, let's look at what Ben Jamal responds to that.
Oh, well, good afternoon, Andrew. I mean, I'm surprised that you're starting there, but I'll answer the question. Part of the reason I'm surprised, I'm sure you've done your research, you'll have seen I've commented on numerous occasions on this issue. I think for every Palestinian spokesperson, probably for 3, 4, 5 months after October the 7th, we were routinely asked that. I'll repeat what I said on October the 8th at a meeting at the Labour Party conference. The framework within which one should judge any act of violence is international law. And international law is very, very clear in prohibiting attacks on civilians. Those are war crimes, so they should be condemned. But international law also enshrines an oppressed people, living under occupation's right to resist, including through armed resistance. So people do have a right to use armed resistance against occupation, against other violations of their rights of self-determination, but they don't have a right to resist by attacking civilians.
So I'm still not clear then, was it legitimate resistance against Israel or not, given?
So no, he gives a very full answer, explains the point, but yet still Andrew Neil's not getting his tailored answer, which he wants to push Ben Jamal into, basically either condemning Hamas on the one hand or condemning the act of violence to resist occupation on the one hand, to either that or supporting what Hamas did in October the 7th and therefore trying to frame him as some sort of radical, terrorist, Islamist type person, even though he comes from a Christian Palestinian background. But anyway, this is what he responds again.
Well, October the 7th involved attack on civilians.
Finish the question. No, I get to finish the question, then you answer. So do you think it was legitimate resistance against Israel, given that Israel didn't occupy Gaza at the time?
I have to stop you there. I have to stop it there, sorry. But notice how subtly Andrew Neil puts in the point, which is that Gaza wasn't under occupation at the time. I'll let Ben Jamal answer, because his answers are very good, actually, really undermines Andrew Neil. But just so, anyway, let him answer, and then I'll add my 2 pennies worth afterwards.
Well, Andrew, I think you probably need to brush up on your understanding of international law with respect.
Well, I would be helped if you just give me a straight answer to a straight question.
Gaza has been subject to an ongoing occupation since 1967. The fact that Israel withdrew its illegal settlements and took most of its troops out of Gaza in 2005 does not alter the fact that it still remained legally occupied under international law. And going back, I've already answered your question. So the events on October the 7th that involved attacks on civilians are illegitimate under international law. Any attack on a civilian is illegal under international law. I don't think I could be more clear.
So no, firstly, the subtle use of trying to put the issue that Gaza somehow wasn't under occupation. Ben Jamal explains the point, and he explains the point, very well and very succinctly. But the issue is and this is what really amazes me. Let's say Gaza wasn't under occupation, but does that mean the West Bank isn't under occupation? No, because West Bank and Gaza are meant to be, quote unquote, one territory, quote unquote, meant to be the Palestinian state, yeah, or at least what's supposedly the Palestinian state. So if any part of the territory of the Palestinians, which is, by the way, only 22% of historic Palestine, it's a measly deal as at best anyway. But even then, any part of that 22% under occupation means that Palestine's under occupation. It's a simple fact. West Bank is under occupation. Hamas is there as a Palestinian resistance movement trying to resist occupation or any of these types of resistance movements. And again, like I said, I don't support them. I'm not, advocating for them. I'm just simply explaining, objectively as I possibly can. But if a part of your land is under occupation and you in an area which may be perceived as being free part of that land, which isn't currently under occupation, has the right to still resist. So West Bank, so whether you live in Gaza or not, but also the point is that Gaza obviously is under occupation. United Nations, the ICJ, they've all ruled that Gaza is under occupation, even if the direct boots on the ground, before October 7th I'm talking about, didn't exist from the Israeli troops because they controlled the air supply, they controlled the airspace, they controlled the waterways, they controlled the land borders, they controlled everything that came in and out of the country. They controlled the electricity, they controlled the fuel, they controlled the food, they controlled, medicine. So they effectively were under an occupation. It's absolutely clear cut. And I'm sure Andrew Neil, this guy is meant to be this big senior journalist, well respected within Britain particularly, yet he doesn't know this. He obviously knows this, but he's pushing Zionist propaganda. That's the issue.
Clear.
So Hamas attacks on the IDF and Israeli security that day on October the 7th, that was legitimate in your view?
Well, you'd have to examine each and every one of those incidents, but international law is very, very clear, and this is part of the problem. And one of the other things I said on October the 8th is those who condemn, and I don't know whether you would be included in this or not, those who condemn Hamas's attacks on the basis of them being a violation of international law and constituting war crimes, but do not condemn Israel's illegal occupation, imposition for over 77 years on all of the Palestinian people of what is widely regarded across the human rights community as a system of apartheid, and since October the 7th, who have not condemned what is widely now regarded across the international human rights community and genocide scholars as a genocide, have no moral foundations on which to issue their condemnation of Hamas. If you believe in international law and the application of it, as I do, then you apply that consistently and universally.
And of course, Israel doesn't accept it as a genocide and many other schools.
It's so funny, isn't it, that here's Ben Jamal. He makes the point. He says, look, if you accept international law, yes, you're going to criticize, you're going to, condemn, if you want to use that word, the attacks against civilians that was undertaken on October the 7th. But if you're going to be consistent, morally consistent, legally consistent, then if under international law, you have an occupation that's been going on for 77 years that has implemented an apartheid state for that amount of time as well, that has enacted a genocide and ethnic cleansing, you have to be morally consistent, legally consistent with the principles that you hold on to. If you're going to condemn October 7th, you've got to condemn all the 77 years of Israeli occupation. Now, what does Andrew Neil say in response to that? He basically says, well, actually, we don't know if there's a genocide or not because other people have said there isn't. It's a joke. Okay, even if you want to park genocide which is one type of crime, by the way, at the side, you've got the numerous other war crimes that have been undertaken by Israel, not least of which is occupation. So at the very least, you can turn around and say, well, yeah, there's an occupation taking place. Yeah, we should condemn that. Yeah, they've killed people in the name of the occupation. Yeah, we probably should condemn that. You know, the issue is that it's so one-sided. He's trying to really push a particular agenda. And here again, he's trying to focus now upon one branch aspect, which is, well, it's not a branch aspect, but one aspect of the numerous lines of violation of international law, and saying, okay, but there is debate over this. There isn't really a debate over it. But anyway, let's go back to what Ben Jamal says in response.
The other scholars
Well,
don't
no,
either,
most people who perpetrate crimes don't accept. I mean,
I'm simply saying it's a matter for debate.
Let me come back, because you
No,
just made a point.
I'm going to ask another question.
I'd like to
I'm
respond
going
to
to
the
ask
point
another
you just
question.
made.
No, because you're bogging down and I want to get on.
Respond briefly to the point you've made.
No, I'm not going to do that.
Vladimir
I'm going to move
Putin
and ask
does
a
not
question.
accept he's engaged in an illegal occupation of Ukraine.
I don't want to talk about Vladimir Putin. I want to talk about your views and what is happening.
So he goes, well, you know, again, I just can't, you know, I'm reiterating the point, which is basically, he's mentioned all of these points of Israel has violated international law. And he's basically saying, if you're going to be consistent and condemn October 7th, you've got to condemn, 77 years of Israel's existence, basically. Yeah. And because of the numerous, apartheid laws, occupation, massacres that have undertaken, ethnic cleansing in its foundations, and also the genocide that's taking place currently in Gaza, which, by the way, the vast majority of people have acknowledged is a genocide. And instead, he's basically said, well, it's up for debate. And then when Ben Jamal wants to respond, he's not letting him respond. He's like, no, you're not going to respond here. No, I'm what my statements are is fact. I'm not going to let you come back in. And then he makes the point that, look, every country that commits war crimes or most countries that commit war crimes don't admit they're committing a war crime. And he's trying to give the example of Vladimir Putin, saying he doesn't acknowledge that he's illegally occupying parts of Ukraine. He thinks this is part of Russian territory due to, Ukrainian-Russian shared history, etc., whatever. So he's just basically saying that you can't use that just because somebody says we're not committing a genocide, we're not committing war crimes, that somehow that makes it a debatable issue. It's not a debatable issue. So, anyway, he carries on.
Now, you were obviously outraged. Many, many people across the world were by the scale and nature of the Israeli retaliation, the destruction of the Gaza Strip, the killing of thousands of civilians, including many children. Is that what prompted you to begin marching, or were you marching before that had happened?
No, our first march in response to what happened, we held a protest on October the 9th, and the first march that we held was on October the 14th, by which time I don't remember the figures, but we had already seen thousands of Palestinians already slaughtered, and we had numerous statements of genocidal intent that were later cited in January 2024 in the case put before the International Court of Justice that was accepted as plausible by the International Court of Justice around Israel's commission of a genocide. To remind your listeners, those included Benjamin Netanyahu. He said this, I think, on October the 7th or at the latest October the 8th, that we will target each and every corner of the Gaza Strip. It will be turned into a deserted island, exactly what Israel has now done. And of course, the notorious comments of Yair Gallant, then the Israeli defense minister, who said nothing is getting into Gaza, no food, no water, no medical supplies, nothing will get in. We are dealing with human animals. So already, yes, when we first marched, we were dealing
which was before Israel had moved against
statements
Gaza.
of genocidal intent and thousands of Palestinians already having been slaughtered.
So you were marching against the intent because it hadn't actually happened on October.
Well, no, thousands of Palestinians had already been killed by the time of our first march.
So this is about a 10-minute interview or so. And what we've seen is Andrew Neil, all of his questions, and also the various responses that has taken up around about 7.5 minutes or so. So out of this 10, 11, 12-minute video. more than half of it is all about the attempt to frame Ben Jamal and Palestinian activists as though they were celebrating the attacks on October 7th and that they weren't protesting against Israeli aggression or Israeli war crimes, etc., Zionist war crimes, that it wasn't about that. It was about their celebration. That's why he's asked the question. He goes, when did you first do your protests? Or he said marches. And so he's trying to basically say, you weren't really worried about, you weren't at the time marching against Israel's aggression and crimes because they hadn't become manifest at that time. Your agenda, your intent was really about against the Jews or against Israel itself. But obviously he wants to push this anti-Semitic angle towards it. This is a subtle point. And Ben Jamal makes he makes a really good point. He said, well, actually, we did a static march on October 9th. And by that time, over 1,000 people had already been killed in Palestine. At that time, we had genocidal statements of intent by Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant to, that described the Palestinians as human animals. So it was clear what was going to happen. So the marches and the protests that were taking place were in response to what we've already experienced Israel done, and at the same time also seen, I'm talking about previously, like in the previous years, but also we've seen thousands of people have been killed within the first few days, which was actually what happened in the first week or so. Thousands were killed. And we had genocidal statements to say that they wanted to ethnically cleanse or wipe out or effectively treat the Palestinians like Amalekites, etc., that had taken place. So, it's clear. But Andrew Neil then says, well, so it was just about the intent, wasn't it? Nothing actually happened at that time. Israel had not done anything at that time. No, Israel were bombing, killing people at a level that we hadn't ever seen before within Gaza at that period of time. And within those first few weeks, we're talking about thousands of people were murdered and slaughtered, many of whom were women and children.
March on October the 14th.
Oh, yeah, but there was a march on October the 9th before that.
No, there was a static demonstration on October the 9th.
It was a demonstration against Israel.
Over 1,000,
you were demonstrating against Israel.
Over 1,000 Palestinians had already been slaughtered.
On
October the 9th, by the way, military analysts, I remember hearing one of them on Newsnight, were already speculating that at least 10 to 20,000 Palestinians were likely to be slaughtered by Israel.
Right. So you were marching on the intent, but let me come back to on these marches, the subsequent marches, a regular cry at them is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Is that your position?
It was a chant. I've been asked this on many occasions.
Just give us the answer.
I was asked it by the Home Affairs Select Committee, and what I'm often asked is, do you tolerate the chant? And I'll repeat what I said. No, we don't tolerate it. We chant it. Why? What does it mean? It speaks to what I've just spoken about, that prior to this genocide, Israel had subjected the Palestinian people for 77 years to a system of apartheid that exists everywhere across historic Palestine. So within the state
of Israel, support the chant,
but also in the occupied Palestinian territory. So Palestinians will be free when that system of apartheid is dismantled across all of the territory between the river and the sea. That's what the chant means.
So you can see, this chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, or Palestinians will be free, seems to be pushed as this constant anti-Semitic, call for the annihilation of Jewish people from the whole of Palestine. It's a call for a genocide against them. And, it just seems like a completely crazy idea, because what he says, no, we want to put an end to the apartheid system, which favors Jewish Israelis above and beyond any other, people within that land, whether they are Palestinian Muslims or whether they are Palestinian Christians or others. That they face a system of discrimination within this country. And, not least of which is what's happening in the West Bank and also in Gaza, where not only are they facing discrimination, but they're facing a brutal occupation which is trying to drive them out of the land, drive them out of West Bank through further settlements and the types of laws and administration that they implement, the regime that they implement above them. And in Gaza, obviously, we see the type of what they have done in the last 2 years to try to push this, push the Palestinians out of this land. The amount of people that have been killed is likely to be in the hundreds of thousands. But yet, for some reason, to ask for, and this is what Ben Jamal says, to ask for equal rights to Jewish Israelis somehow is akin to seeing the genocide of the Jews. And we'll see really what the real agenda here is when Andrew Neil starts to respond to some of these points.
So, and the river is the River Jordan and the sea is the Mediterranean.
Sure.
If Palestine is defined as being between that river and that sea, there is no more Israel, is there?
Well, there can, as part of any solution, not be any state that's practicing the crime of apartheid. So, if Israel were to continue to exist as an apartheid state, that would not be an acceptable solution. In the same way, there was no solution to the situation in South Africa that left apartheid in still functioning.
What would Israel have to do, in your view, not to be an apartheid state?
Dismantle its structure of apartheid, dismantle all of the laws that define Palestinian citizens of Israel as unequal. To give one example,
and allow any Palestinian to return, right?
Allow the Palestinian right of return, which is enshrined in international law. It's not
which would mean no more, which you and I know, let's not dance on a pin here, would mean no more Israel. That's what you want.
This is a clip. So it's just amazing, isn't it? So Andrew Neil basically makes the point, goes, so you want the rights of return of Palestinians. Palestinians who were made refugees in 48 and in 67, who have the right of return, according to, as Ben Jamal mentions, international law, that Andrew Neil say, well, if they're allowed to right of return, then there would be no more Israel, would there? There would be no more Jewish state, etc. So, what does he want to do? Just break international law? And then it goes back to the consistency, like I said, the consistency of, and Ben Jamal also pointed out, on the one hand, you want people to condemn October 7th because it's a violation of international law, but at the same time, you're willing to violate international law when it's to protect the state of Israel, or when it is to allow the structure of apartheid and occupation to continue through the Zionist occupation. So you're allowed to, break international law, allow them to occupy, allow them to commit genocide, allow them to commit massacres, prevent refugees from returning back to their homes that they were ethnically cleansed from. That's all okay. But, what October 7th, no, that's the paradigm by which we have to view all of this.
You either want Israel to surrender or negotiate itself out of existence. That's what you want.
Well, no, Andrew, I'm often asked this question, usually framed in a different way. But it lies behind what you're asking me, which is what happens to Israelis if apartheid is dismantled? And I will say, well, the same as South Africa. What happened to white South Africans when apartheid was dismantled? The majority of them stayed and committed themselves to being part of a post-apartheid future. Everybody that lives in the territory between the river and the sea has rights. But nobody.
And Israel would cease to be a Jewish state.
Nobody has rights.
Israel would cease to be a Jewish state, correct?
You're going to have to let me finish answering the questions.
No, I'm going to try and get you to answer the question. Would Israel cease to be a Jewish state?
It's crazy, isn't it? Just mid-sentence wants to stop him. And it's all about, well, would Israel cease to be a Jewish state if we implement international law and allow Palestinians who are ethnically cleansed from their land to return back to their land? And that goes to the point, that goes to the heart of this issue. The fact that the Jews don't have the demographics to justify the idea that they are the sole occupancies or the sole right to hold sovereignty over historic Palestine. They just don't have the demographics. Why? Because even now, even if you don't take the right of return, the refugees that live outside of historic Palestine into consideration, and only look at the number of Palestinians that live within historic Palestine, so that's what they call the Zionist entity Israel or West Bank and Gaza, then the Palestinians are either 50-50 or 53% majority, with 47% being the minority Jews. So the majority are the Palestinians, even currently in historic Palestine. That's why what Israel needs to do to maintain its own, nation-statehood, whatever you want to call it, their own ethno-racial supremacist state, what they have to do is they have to consistently or constantly try to change the demographics by either increasing the inflow of Jews, but there's only 15 million of them around the world or so, or which is what they've also been trying to do by driving out Palestinians from the West Bank, from Gaza, and refusing the right of return of Palestinians who were made refugee from 48 and 67 and onwards. So they want to refuse that so they can cleanse the land, become the dominant majority within that country, and therefore justify, by changing what they call the facts on the ground, justify their own existence as a Jewish entity.
It would cease to be a Jewish state if what you mean by that, and this is what Benjamin Netanyahu means by that, a state which can privilege the rights of Jewish people above Palestinians. No state has the right to do that, in the same way South Africa did not have the right to privilege the rights of white South Africans above black South Africans. It's not that difficult.
But it does have a right to maintain, if it sees it a Jewish majority. There are plenty of Islamic states in the world. Why can't there be one Jewish state?
Well, how, Andrew, I'll ask you a question. And you're right, Israel claims the right to be able to preserve a Jewish majority. How does it do that? What are the policies it enacts to do that? The way it does that is by denying, first of all, the Palestinian people their right of return, which is a violation of international law, but also through a series of policies that make life extremely difficult for Palestinians so they leave. Forced expulsion of Palestinians, that's going on right now in the West Bank, it's happened in East Jerusalem. So that's how Israel, through a series of policies, seeks to try to preserve a Jewish majority. No state has the right to do that.
Really? Not even all the Arab states?
No, if they are enacting laws that discriminate against people,
You've been to Saudi Arabia?
Oh my God, it's like Islamophobic. He just made the point, which is saying that, look, the way they maintain a Jewish majority is through apartheid laws that forces people to leave the country, expulsion, stealing of land, committing genocide, ethnic cleansing. All of these things are the ways by which they, maintain Jews as a majority within Israel. Also, preventing the right of return, which goes against and violates, according to what Ben Jamal is saying, is international law. All of this is what? And so what does Andrew Neil say? Well, yeah, you've got a point, actually. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. How do you stop the Palestinians living in this area, and having equal rights and maintain this Jewish state? We have to get rid of the Palestinians. That doesn't make sense. That's not right. No, what does he say? He goes, well, what about the Arab states? Oh, it's such a dumb, low-level argument. It's such a Zionist talking about. There's so many Islamic states, so many Arab states. Why can't they just go to one of them? So many white, European states. Why can't the Jews just take one of their countries as well? Give them Belgium. Give them Holland. Yeah, give them parts of Germany. There's so many white countries out there. So why don't you just give some of that to them? It doesn't make sense. It's not an argument. Literally isn't an argument, especially when you had to take somebody else's land who were indigenous to the land.
On the basis of their religion, of their ethnicity, I would stand against any system of ethno-nationalism wherever it exists. There is a commonality between people across the world at the moment who are trying to promulgate ideologies of ethno-nationalism. That's why the Minister of Diaspora Affairs in Israel has just invited Tommy Robinson to make a visit.
All right, Ben Jamal, I'm afraid I had a lot more to ask you, but you walked down memory lane, and too many cases meant I couldn't get to it. Maybe you'll come back and we can try again with more time. That's Ben Jamal there, director of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign.
Yeah, so right at the end, he really tries to gaslight the audience to say, well, I had so much I wanted to ask. Over half of his conversation was all around October 7th. This guy didn't have anything else. He wanted to frame and push Ben Jamal and generally Palestinian activists as people who basically want to kill all Jews, from the river to the sea means the end of Jews within Palestine, that they were celebrating October 7th. That's why they were so early in their protests and the marches. Then, Israel had not even done anything wrong by that time. Obviously, Ben Jamal completely refutes that. And, all of the discussions, all of the talking points was all centered around that. And as soon as Ben Jamal mentions the issue of, apartheid, occupation, genocide, the violations of international law, all of that was just sidelined, shifted away. We're told to ignore that and focus us. The Palestinians are the problem. And even then, he's giving this argument that somehow it's right for Jews to have the Jewish majority. And, why we all these Arab states, effectively what he's trying to say is, why can't these Palestinians go to there? Let this poor Jewish people have their own state, yeah? These Palestinians, come on, they're all Arabs, all the same. They all look alike. Give them their own state, yeah? Get them to move into the other people's lands, yeah? And get rid of these people, these, 10, 15 million or so Palestinians. Just take them away from that. That's what, that's the subtext of it all. And just as a final remark for myself, why this particular interview is so well done by Ben Jamal isn't necessarily because we believe in international law. We know there are fundamental flaws in regards to this. Its institutions, its structural biases, its ideological biases. But the point that he did is he demonstrated the absolute hypocrisy of the pro-Zionist camp, and he exposed the pro-Zionist media as being, complete buffoons, completely agenda driven, and not really interested in pursuing, the truth that journalists are meant to do. They're meant to pursue the truth. Anyway, Jazakallah khair. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Give it a like, share, subscribe, all that. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.